Unfortunately, one of our speakers couldn't make it because of the snow in the northeast, Kia, so that's unfortunate. A few other attendees also could not make it because of the same situation, but we're here. I want to introduce my colleague, Marvin. He works for UNPO. He's the U.S. coordinator. He's going to make some opening remarks on behalf of UNPO. I also want to point out the other speakers, Dr. John Prados. He works for the National Security Archives. He's a senior fellow. He has the Archives Intelligence Documentation Project and the Vietnam Project. He has a PhD in Political Science, International Relations from Columbia University. He's the author of nearly 30 books and many articles, analyst of national security, and the book most pertinent, I would say, to the Laos situation is Safer Democracy, The Secret Wars of the CIA. He's also the author of Ghosts of Langley, Into the CIA's Heart of Darkness, Vietnam, Unwinnable War, Keeper of the Keys, and Combined Fleet Decoded, and they were all nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. We also have Jim Mua, Secretary of the Congress of the Hmong People, and I'll let Marvin speak on behalf of the UNPO.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you very much for being here today. We would have hoped for a little bit of a higher turnout, but unfortunately the weather prevented some people from attending today. I'm honored to welcome you today on behalf of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, and again I would like to thank Gimbei and John for being here today. I think this discussion is very important, and just to give you a quick rundown of the events today, John's going to talk a little bit about the secret war in Laos and Vietnam, and then Gimbei is going to explain a little bit about what the situation of the Hmong is today in northern Laos, because his community is still affected by the events that happened during the Vietnam War. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, UNPO is an international nonviolent democratic membership organization, and at the moment we have 40-something members. All of them are minority groups, indigenous groups, unrepresented states or occupied territories. And they came together in 1991 to found the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization to share their stories and learn from each other to see which strategies work best to work on the international level, because these actors below the states often find it more difficult to access state-based organizations such as the United Nations, for example. To give just a very quick summary of what this topic is about, because I think our other speakers will talk more on this. Since the Hmongs flight toward the jungle after the end of the Vietnam War, the Lao government has attempted to systematically eradicate these communities who are still out there hiding to this day in the jungle. And today the Hmong situation in northern Laos is dire, and they suffer from a lack of recognition of their indigenous status, which affects all walks of their life, not just the ones in the jungle, but also the Hmong community at large in Laos. This situation prevents them from receiving any form of legal protection they would be entitled to under international law, for example. Their cultural and religious rights are systematically violated, as are religious activities. They don't have access to education in their own language, for example, which excludes them from later on then accessing the job market, for example. Those Hmong communities living in remote rural areas or in the jungle, for example, are the ones that are most affected by food insecurity, and they don't have access to any basic services such as healthcare facilities or food or clean drinking water. Their customary lands are often allocated to companies for industrial exploitation. Even though Laos has signed but not ratified the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, many of them, especially those who surrender to the Lao military, get forcibly disappeared, and then some of them are later, their bodies are later dumped in rivers, and then that's how they're found. Especially since September 2017, the military campaign against the Hmong has severely intensified in the area. And there are even allegations, which of course are difficult to prove, but there are allegations that the Lao military uses chemical warfare against these groups, which I'm sure Gimbe will talk about a little bit more as well. UNPO's modest role today and every day is to offer a platform for peoples like the Hmong, whose voices might not necessarily be heard loud enough on the international stage. So in the name of UNPO again, I would like to thank everybody for being here. The event is also being live streamed on Facebook, so feel free to share the event with your contacts, and then the video will be available as well. So I don't want to take up too much time, and I will give over to you, John.
Okay. Let me start by saying that the Hmong are people who have been victimized by location. Their location in the hills of Upper Laos made their existence and their activities critical in a series of events that started actually in the 1950s and went through the entire French and American wars in Vietnam. During the French War, already the Hmong were being recruited by French special services as part of what the French called supplétifs, as part of a commando group that was going to theoretically act behind enemy lines. So at the point really where the Pathet Lao just began getting going in the 52-53 period, already the French were recruiting Hmong to work in their commando units. Now, Bang Pao, who became a general in the Royal Laotian Army and was considered to be the leader of the Hmong military operation, and Tubi Li Fung, who was the Lao political leader, were already leaders of the Lao in 1953-54 when the French were fighting at Dien Bien Phu. And they continued to be leaders of the Hmong right into the 1960s, rising to even higher levels. In the American War, I would say the United States came into Laos in the 1950s after the first Geneva Agreement and were dissatisfied with the idea that Laos could be neutral. The United States did things to actually bring Laos back into the conflict, and among the things that they did was to mobilize the Hmong as a CIA covert operations project. So starting in 1959 and with increasing force right through the entire decade of the 60s and through the end of the Vietnam War in the 1970s, the Hmong were fighting for the CIA, essentially a parallel war to the war that was carried out by the Royal Laotian government from Vientiane and Luang Prabang. And that's an important thing to note here, because there has always been, and have always been, long before the American War, or even the French period, differences, ethnic, religious, and so forth, between lowland Lao and upland Hmong. And those differences replicated themselves in the course of the war in Southeast Asia in the 1960s and 1970s. Also, the situation grows even more complex because as part of its mobilization of the Hmong, the CIA engaged in what the United States theoreticians called nation building. That meant, in a certain respect, modernization. Cultural and social modernization process was initiated among the Hmong by the CIA in the course of carrying out the secret war. The first junior high school in Hmong country was built by the CIA. The first regional hospital, the first high school. The Hmong got a radio station courtesy of the CIA. The first Hmong newspapers and a network of local shops and markets, all created in the course of this modernization that was called nation building. Now, that has other implications because that accentuated the differences between lowland Lao and upland Hmong. The lowland Lao were that much more afraid of the Hmong. And the lowland Lao were, although not willing to actually start a war against the Hmong themselves, the lowland Lao were willing to discriminate against Hmong, and that posed significant problems in this whole cultural and warfare situation. Although Tubi Lifung became a minister in the Royal Laotian government, and although Vang Pao was a general in the Lao army and a commander of a Laotian military region, that did not significantly reduce the differences, cultural and otherwise, between Hmong and Lao. And this was an operative factor throughout the American war in Vietnam. So what the CIA was essentially doing was to create a nation within a nation. The problem with that is the problem that will always arise. This is now a reference to general covert operations and CIA covert warfare. A problem that will always arise when you mobilize a minority within a country for a military operational / paramilitary purpose. And that is, you set up differences, distinctions, and conflicts between the minority that you're raising up and the national government. But from the United States perspective, the American interest is to work with the national government. So when the moment comes that you have to choose between the people that you yourself have recruited and the national government that you're allied with, the decision that Washington is going to have to make is usually pretty clear. In the Laotian situation, we almost made that decision one time. In the 61-62 period, the Pathet Lao were very powerful. They were pressing in on the Hmong, and they were chasing them from their villages. The United States, at the highest level now we're talking about the interagency unit that made decisions on covert operations for the Kennedy administration. That unit itself, during this time, made a decision as to whether to relocate the Hmong. They actually talked about moving the Hmong from where they lived in the uplands of Laos into Thailand, back across the Mekong River to occupy Sayaburi province, which is the western bank province of Laos that's across the Mekong River. Now, I submit to you that if the Americans had actually made that decision, the Hmong would have refused to move. Nevertheless, I will say that the Americans did consider doing this, and they almost reached that decision, but they decided they would wait and see what happened. And in the meantime, some of the sort of courageous USAID figures and some other people cooperated in helping the Hmong move to the area where they existed or were centered through the rest of the American war. The Samtong, Longcheng area was occupied by them at this time, and that was their center for the rest of the American war. If you go through the American war, what essentially happened was that the Hmong fought loyally for the American side in the war. They gradually extended their military means in the American fighting. The Pathet Lao would attack in the dry season, the Lao would go back in the rainy season, or maybe it was the other way around. Gets confusing sometimes. But by the time around 1970, the Lao were so worn out from the war that they could no longer hold their own militarily, and the CIA began importing Thai troops, both irregulars and eventually regulars as well, to fight alongside the Hmong against the Pathet Lao. And for the remainder of the American war, that was the situation that obtained. The United States signed a ceasefire agreement in Paris in 1972, and Americans formally pulled back from the war as a whole, but that left the Hmong still fighting in Laos alongside the Royal Laotian government against the Pathet Lao. So from the period from 1972 to 1975, there was a kind of a broken-backed war where the Hmong, with reduced support and less Thai help, continued to try and do the best that they could against the Pathet Lao. And eventually the Pathet Lao overcame the lowland Lao as well and took over the Laotian government in 1975. The consequence of that was to replicate the events of 1961. That is to say, the Hmong were stuck with now a national government that was against them, no American support, and few prospects for the future. Some Hmong evacuated with Air America from Longcheng in 1975 as the collapse was happening, and there were brave Air America air crews who worked to evacuate numbers of the Hmong. But the vast majority of the Hmong people were left behind to exfiltrate into Thailand if they could, or to stay in place if they had to. And that was essentially the situation that obtained after the war. Many Hmong gathered in camps in Thailand. Eventually, an agreement with the Thais and the Americans enabled many of those Hmong to emigrate to the United States. Unlike the Vietnamese, for whom the Americans passed a bill authorizing immediate immigration of many Vietnamese, the Hmong had to more or less make their own way to America after the war. And that was the sort of starting point of the Hmong immigration problem for the United States, and for the Hmong. And I'll turn it over to you at that point.
Sure, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. It's quite interesting. But what happened, after the treaty was signed in 1972, that treaty was called Paris Peace Accord. Okay, and that being said, that all international military personnel to withdraw completely from Southeast Asia. Okay, and then all American personnel and everybody withdrew from Southeast Asia, including the Vietnamese Viet Cong that also came to Laos. But what happened was that they did not withdraw. Okay, so they were hiding in the jungles. And during 1975, the Hmong was facing max, detention, facing human rights abuse and detained, sent into educational camp. So the Pathet Lao begins to go village to village in searching for the people who are affiliated with the American during the Vietnam War. So everybody was scared at that time. So what happens that the Hmong made a mass migration, walking the road, crossing, Vang Vieng to Hin He, and hopefully to Mekong River and then to Thailand. But what happened when they reached to Hin He bridge, and you probably heard that bridge, and the Lao government was blocked on the other side. Okay, and then when these people crossing the bridge, and when they got to the middle of the bridge, immediately AK-47 was fired from the other side. Okay? Many people were killed on that bridge. People jump off the bridge, people killed, many people ran back. Okay, and then from then on, the leaders of the Hmong people, they thought that was the end of their route to Thailand. So they had no choice but to form a political organization and combine their force and use whatever left or whatever they can get, weapons, and you name it, and they're gonna, start defend the aggression of the Patela. So President Zhong Zhuohe, who was the leader of that time, organized the people, and about 60,000 to 50 to 60,000 Hmong, they moved to Pubia, and they called sizable special zone in that region. Okay, and immediately in 79 to 80, the Vietnamese troops and Lao troops that were hiding in the jungle, they combined the force and chasing the Hmong in that region. Okay, years after years, and on and on and on. And many Hmong people died in those areas, in that regions. And since then, many Hmong surrendered to the Lao government, and many also find themselves, ways end up in Thailand into refugee camps, and coming to the third world country. So that's what happened. And but right now, let me back a little bit. The Zhong Zhuohe, they organized the Hmong group that they think about, that they're going to defend the rights in the region. They call United Hmong Jaffa Democracy. And many Hmong people, they only know Jaffa, okay, which means were labeled very negatively, from the Lao perspective, like Jaffa means crazy, and all kinds insane war, things like that. But that's not true. That is a propaganda, a negative propaganda from the Lao perspective toward the Hmong. What happened was, Hmong, when they do something, they always pray God. They're using, essence, and candles, and they pray God, pray heaven before they do it. So that's why the Lao government said the Hmong, it's Jaffa, meaning they're crazy, they're insane. Okay? But that is not true. So the United Hmong Jaffa Democracy was formed under President Zhong Zhuohe, and then the war in the region stopped, going day in and day out, until today. And Zhong Zhuohe died in 1999, and then immediately after that, Pak Ko-he was he took over Zhong Zhuohe position, and then Pak Ko-he was led groups in the Sanyaburi section where you're talking about, until I think 2002, when Pak Ko-he passed away in that area. And then from then on, President Song Lo-he was taking over the position as president. And now he is currently a leader, leading a group of Hmong people, about 1,000, in the Sai Sugun region near Pubia, the area. And I call it the ethnic war between the Lao and the Hmong. It's just head to head until today, right now. So what happened is that all these activities got into the United Nations. They kind of understand what the situation. I think it began where the 26 children was murdered in Mang Bien, and then it got to the Patricia Hack, which is the U.S. ambassador at that time, 2006, and that incident become an idol, for the Hmong situation at the international level. especially for the racial
Subcommittee.
subcommittee, and that tension, that creating a idols in that particular section. So then we come in and we say, look, this is not right. What happened? How come these people are still fighting in Laos? I mean, the war's over, but what happened? So we, as a young generation, we start digging what's happening. And we say, oh, look at this. This is what happened. This is what happened. So now the human rights issues become a concern and interest at the international level, especially the Human Rights Office, and they issues many recommendations that the Lao government need to comply, and the Lao government rejected. The answer come back and say, hey, there's nothing between the Hmong and us in our country. We live in peace and harmony. What are you talking about? So they denied everything, and that is also a concern to us, that what do we need to do to get the attention of the international community. So we tried everything we could, and we did not. Looks like everything it just stopped there. It going nowhere, like no interest on our issues, and we just don't know what's going on, And we later found out that the Hmong situation is very sensitive at the international levels. We don't know how sensitive, but I guess because of the treaties, I guess because of the secret war, the name's so secret in Laos and things like that, we don't know. So lately, the tensions, it's ongoing. The interest is ongoing at the United Nations, and that lead to a couple of hearings on the Laos during the UPR sections. And again, we participate in the UPR, and the Lao government deny everything. They say it's just some sort of organization that try to paint a bad image for the Lao government during the UPR. So now looks like the Hmong case or the Hmong situation is going nowhere at the international level. So we try to advocate very heavily at the European Union, and also begin here in the U.S. government. And we're hoping that one day they're recognize that indeed there is situation there that need to be taken care of. And I don't know what is the best way to take care of those issues, but we are more concerned on the human rights issues in the region. And we are hoping that someday someone or a government or some U.S. representative will step in and say, look, we need to do something. And we are hoping on that. And right now, it looks like at the international level, they are working on the Millennium Development Goal, and the Lao government is its goal is to make sure that their country are in peace and harmony by 2020. So lately, they using a lot of their militaries personnel cornering people in the region. They are constructing more military bases in the region, and the people there are facing a tough time. They don't know how they're going to live, this year, but they are moving constantly, place to place, just to hide out and make sure they don't, face any danger to the children. So, at the region. So they are moving, day in and day out, in the region. And this week we are here to talk to some of the legislative in the Congress and hoping that we have a good result, but we'll see. And that's what happened right now. Yeah, and people still trapped there and still fighting, still clash here and there. A lot of civilians are being killed. President He just called the other day that the Lao government is continue using some kind of chemical weapons that spray to the region, and a lot of people got sick. They got vomiting and weakness of legs and arms and puffy eyes and things like that. So that is something that we need to look at. They also launching heavy weapons artillery like this, 60 mm, 80 mm, 120, 130 throughout the region where they believe that the Hmongs hide out. And that is also a concern that the U.S. need to address. And we alone could not do anything, but because of the relationship that the Hmong has with the United States, and we believe that the United States should voice on that matters too. And I also understand that the friendship between the Lao government and the United States begin to become fruitful, but that does not prevent the United States to say, hey, why don't you leave the Hmong people alone? Let them move on to their lives and just don't do anything to them. So I think the United States has the obligation to say or to work in a diplomatic way so that we all at the same time keeping the good relationship with the Lao government. And that's all I have to say, unless...
How many Hmong do you think are trapped inside Laos today?
Right now, about 1,000. Yes.
And in Thailand, are there still refugee camps?
No. But there are a lot of undocumented Hmong veterans that live scattered throughout Thailand.